This is my military collage, contrasting the British and Continental armies. This picture over here shows that the British had 470 ships overseas to fight in America. This was a strength to the British because the ships had cannons. By using that, the British could destroy the Continental Army in the American Revolutionary War. This picture right here shows that the British had Indians on their side to help them in the war. This was also a strength to the British because the more helpers they got in the war helped because this increased the amount of soldiers that fought in the war. This picture over here shows that the British had about 4,500 soldiers. This was another strength to the British because since most of the British soldiers were extensively trained, they could put all of their strength together and defeat the Continental Army. On the other hand, the Continental Army didn't have trained soldiers that were experienced. They just had volunteer soldiers. This picture here shows privateers attacking a British supply ship. This was a weakness because if the British soldiers needed more supplies to use in the war, they wouldn't get them. This was because the privateers kept most of the goods they captured before they destroyed the ship. This picture over here shows colonists capturing weapons. This was a weakness because it decreased the amount of weapons the British could use during the war. Also, this picture here seems like the colonists killed one of the British soldiers. This was because the British were hated by most people. This picture right here shows a common sense pamphlet created by Thomas Paine. This was a weakness to the British because the pamphlet persuaded people to become patriots and fight for their freedom. By this happening, more people became patriots and now dislike the British. Now we're on the Continental Army collage. Over here, this picture shows women helping the Continental Army. This is a strength because the women helped the sick and wounded, cooked dinner, and mended clothes. On the other hand, the British didn't have women on their side because they were hated by most people. This picture right here shows George Washington. This is also a strength to the Continentals because Washington was a good army leader and he worked hard to train his men for the war. He taught them to obey and fight together. By Washington teaching his soldiers these techniques, it made the soldiers better at fighting. And then over here, this picture shows George Washington and the Continental Army. This was a strength because George Washington encouraged his soldiers to believe that they could beat the mighty British. This gave the soldiers courage and leadership. Now, on the weaknesses, this picture shows the militiamen. This was a weakness because they were soldiers who worked part-time. Some of the volunteers were poor farmers, merchants, and workers. With that said, most of the Continental Army were inexperienced soldiers. Unlike the British, they had skilled soldiers. And then this picture here shows a sign that says no money. This is a weakness because the money reflects to the Continental Army. The Continental Army had little money to buy supplies or pay the soldiers. The volunteers had to supply their own uniforms and guns. They also had a lack of weapons to use in the war. Unlike the British, they had enough money to pay for the supplies and pay the soldiers. And then over here is a picture that shows a small man about to do a battle with a giant. This was a weakness because it showed the small, untrained Continental Army going up against the well-trained British Army. Now on the analytical response. And the prompt says, how did the Continentals manage to defeat the stronger British Army during the Revolutionary War? Be sure to use specific details, evidence, advantages/disadvantages to support your response. This is my response. The Continentals managed to defeat the British Army during the Revolutionary War because of 3 reasons. The first reason why the Continentals won against the British Army in the Revolutionary War was because they had more motivation than the British. The second reason why the Continentals won against the British Army in the Revolutionary War was because they had women on their side to help mend their clothes, cook dinner for the soldiers, and help the sick and wounded. The last reason why the Continentals won against the British Army during the Revolutionary War is because the British had less motivation to win the war. analytical response continued. The Continentals had more motivation than Britain. Their motivation was freedom. The Continentals were a part of Britain and wanted to break away from them because the King of Britain was using unfair taxes and harsh laws onto them. The Continentals didn't like what Britain was doing to them, so they wanted to live in America where they could be free and not be ruled by a king. They were also trying to make a better future for themselves. Even though the Continental Army lost over 2,500 men in 1777 through 1778, the soldiers refused to give up. To some Continental soldiers, these things were worth dying for. Another reason why the Continentals won in the Revolutionary War is because the Continentals had women to mend their clothes, cook dinner, and help the sick and wounded. The women saved soldiers when they were hurt or sick, instead of having soldiers dying in pain and not able to fight in the war. On the other hand, the British had no women on their side to help them in the war. With that said, the soldiers that were hurt or sick probably died because they didn't have anyone to take care of them. That decreased the amount of soldiers that Britain had, so they would have to send more soldiers across the Atlantic Ocean, which took about 6 months to Britain and back into America to fight in the war. Also, while the soldiers were fighting in the war, the women made dinner for them. Then, if the soldiers needed new uniforms or needed their uniforms to be fixed, the women would mend their clothes and make them new uniforms. On the other hand, the British would have to fix their uniforms because they had no one else to do it. That was another advantage the Continental Army had during the Revolutionary War. The third reason why the Continentals managed to defeat the British Army during the Revolutionary War is because the British Army had less motivation to win the war. Most British soldiers were fighting in the war because it was their job, not to defend their homes or rights, unlike the Continental Army. The British government had other than the war to worry about, like worrying about possible enemies like France and Spain. Plus, the British were surrounded by people who disliked and even hated them. With the British not having the strong motivation, they didn't have the drive to fight as hard as the Continental Army. These are the three main reasons why the Continentals managed to win the Revolutionary War against the British. Thank you for watching my presentation.